So the book of Malachi, prophecy of Malachi, is thought it was written about 60 to 70 years after the completion of the temple. So the exiles have returned to Jerusalem from Babylon. The temple has been rebuilt. The walls are about to be rebuilt. So it's thought Malachi is a contemporary of Ezra and Nehemiah. At the time, there was widespread religious disillusionment and discontent. The people, as we've heard in Zechariah and in Ezra, they'd fallen short of what was expected of them. And when they're challenged about it, as we saw in Ezra chapter 10, the people then acknowledged they were in the wrong and did something about it. But by the time we get to Malachi, the people could see nothing wrong with how they were living and how they approached God in worship. And this time, though, when they're challenged about it, they defend their behaviour. They don't admit their wrongdoing or their sin. And as we're going to see, they'll go even further and accuse God of not keeping his side of the covenant. God not keeping his side of the bargain. They have an attitude by this time of religious cynicism. You know, the temple had been finished. But where were the crowds that had been promised them in Zechariah? The land, it remains an economic and political backwater. What had happened to the nations flooding in? And in all honesty, actually few of the people had returned from exile. God, you've not kept your promises. So renowned, world power, wealth, it hadn't come. Independence hadn't come. They were still under Assyrian rule, a vassal state. But the people, they felt they'd done their bit. They'd rebuilt the temple. They were carrying out their worship, their sacrifices. But God's not kept his side of the bargain. And so they ignore God. They try and get what they can for themselves by their own means, their own mechanisms. And that, in effect, was affecting their living and the temple worship. And many of the sins, the wrongdoings that we're going to hear about or read about are the same as those we read about in Ezra, and we'll read about them again in Nehemiah. Corruption of the priesthood, poor leadership, reluctance to pay the tithe to support the temple, taking advantage of the poor and the oppressed and the marginalised, and intermarriage. So Malachi prophesies between Ezra and Nehemiah, it's thought, and he's sent to expose the cynicisms and the disobedience that's going on in Jerusalem. He's going to remind the people of the reality of God's love for them, that their worship in the temple has just become routine. They're going through the motions, and that actually that's an insult to God. He's going to rebuke the priests and the leaders who are failing to live up to the standards expected of them, and in even worse, are colluding with the people in sin. So Malachi, he writes at a time when the Israelites have returned from exile to the homeland. The temple has been rebuilt. The walls of the city are being rebuilt under the leadership of Nehemiah. You would think that everything was great, but it isn't. In summary, people are going to the temple, they're obeying the law, they're offering their sacrifices, they're performing the religious rituals, but God's not being honoured through it. The people are simply going through the motions. And for us, lest we get complacent, the conditions we're going to see in Malachi are not unique. They're similar to the conditions that Timothy warns Christians about in 2 Timothy chapter 3. But mark this, there will be terrible times in the last days. People will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient to their parents, ungrateful, unholy, without love, unforgiving, slanderous, without self-control, brutal, not lovers of the good, treacherous, rash, conceited, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. Have nothing to do with them. The people in Malachi's day, they had a form of godliness. They looked great, they looked religious, but they were denying God's power. They were outwardly religious, but it's just a superficial show. It was a warning for the Christians of Timothy's day. It was a warning for us as well. Malachi is a warning we need to hear.